I've perfected the art of smiling through my pain. But every time I see his face across the table, I feel like I'm drowning all over again. It's funny how we're taught that family is supposed to be your safe haven, a place of comfort and love. For me, family gatherings are a battlefield. It's not the kind of battle with raised voices or thrown plates. No, it's the silent war I fight within myself every time I walk into the room and see him. I won't say his name because even now, the thought of giving him any more power than he already took from me makes my skin crawl. What I will tell you is that he's someone everyone in my family respects, someone who is greeted with hugs and laughter every time he arrives. To the world, he's charming, successful, and as my grandmother likes to say, a pillar of the community. To me, he's the reason I haven't been able to sleep through the night since I was 11 years old. Back then, I didn't have the words to describe what happened. How could I? I was a child, and he was an adult. A trusted one at that. I didn't know what abuse was, and I certainly didn't think it could come from someone so close to me. It happened during one of those long summer weekends when families gather for barbecues and board games, the kind of days where kids run barefoot in the grass and adults sip wine on the porch. I was always a shy kid, the type who preferred books over people. That day, I was curled up in the corner of the living room reading, while the adults laughed loudly outside. He found me alone. At first, it seemed innocent, just a relative checking in on the quiet kid, but then his hand lingered too long on my shoulder. His compliments felt too personal, too intimate for someone my age. I remember my stomach tightening, a kind of instinctual alarm I didn't yet understand. "You're growing up so fast," he said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "You're so beautiful." I didn't know how to respond. I remember mumbling a thank you and looking back down at my book, hoping he'd go away. But he didn't. Instead, he sat down next to me, his body too close to mine. I won't go into the details of what happened next because even now, years later, it feels like swallowing shards of glass to talk about it. What I will say is this: it wasn't violent in the way people think abuse always is. It was subtle, insidious, designed to confuse me more than anything else. By the time he finally left the room, I wasn't even sure what had just happened. All I knew was that something felt wrong, deeply, irrevocably wrong. For weeks after, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I'd misunderstood. But then it happened again, and again. It became a pattern. Family gatherings where I'd do everything I could to avoid being alone, and moments when he'd catch me anyway. I started to dread the sound of his voice, the sight of his shadow falling across the doorway. I wanted to tell someone. I really did. But who'd believe me? He were loved by everyone, respected, trusted. I was just a kid with a wild imagination, or at least that's what I told myself. And so I stayed silent. But silence has a way of eating you alive. By the time I was 15, I'd started having panic attacks. I couldn't concentrate at school, couldn't even sit through family dinners without feeling like I was suffocating. My parents noticed, of course, but I always shrugged it off. Just stress, I'd say. Just tired. I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. How do you look your parents in the eye and tell them that someone they love, someone they trust, has been hurting you for years? The breaking point came when I turned 16. It was another family gathering, Thanksgiving, to be exact. I remember standing in the kitchen, helping my mom mash potatoes, when he walked in. "Hey kiddo," he said, ruffling my hair like I was still that 11-year-old in the living room. My stomach churned, but I forced a smile. "You've really grown up," he said, his eyes lingering just a second too long. And that's when I snapped. I dropped the potato masher, the clang echoing through the kitchen, and walked out without saying a word. I didn't stop walking until I was outside, gasping for air as if the walls themselves had been closing in on me. My mom followed me, her face etched with concern. "What's wrong?" she asked. "What happened?" And for the first time in years, I let the words spill out. I don't remember everything I said to my mom that day. The words came out in bursts, jumbled and messy, like a dam breaking after years of pressure. I told her about the living room, the compliments, the touches that never felt right. I told her how I'd been carrying this secret for years, how it had eaten away at me, how I couldn't take it anymore. Her face went pale. I could see the war in her eyes, shock, anger, disbelief, and something else I couldn't quite name. "Are you sure?" she asked finally, her voice trembling. I felt my stomach sink. I knew that question was coming. I also knew it wasn't because she didn't believe me. It was because she didn't want to believe it could be true. "Yes," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I'm sure." She pulled me into a hug, and for the first time in years, I felt safe. But that safety was short-lived. The next few weeks were a blur of difficult conversations. My mom told my dad, who reacted exactly as I expected. Anger, fury, and a sense of helplessness that seemed to crush him. They wanted to confront my abuser immediately, but I begged them not to. "If you say something, it'll destroy the family," I said, my voice breaking. "Nobody will believe me anyway." I could see the conflict in their eyes. They wanted to protect me, to make things right, but they also didn't want to shatter the fragile web of relationships holding our family together. In the end, they made a choice that still haunts me to this day. They decided to keep it quiet. I thought keeping the secret would give me some semblance of peace. Instead, it made everything worse. Now, every family gathering felt like walking into a lion's den. My parents would watch me like hawks, their eyes darting between me and my abuser, as if trying to shield me with their presence. But no amount of hovering could erase the tension in the air, the unspoken truth that hung between us like a storm cloud. My abuser, of course, acted as if nothing had happened. He laughed, joked, and played the part of the perfect family member, while I sat there, barely holding myself together. And then came the whispers. It started small. Comments from relatives about how quiet I'd become, how I didn't seem to enjoy family gatherings like I used to. My cousins would tease me for being too serious, and my aunts would ask if I was feeling okay. I wanted to scream every time someone asked what was wrong. What was wrong? Everything. The real breaking point came 2 years later, at my cousin's wedding. It was supposed to be a joyous occasion, a celebration of love and family. Instead, it became the night my world came crashing down again. I was standing near the dance floor, sipping a glass of water, when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Hey kiddo," he said, his voice as smooth and insincere as ever. "You look great tonight." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, my throat tightening as panic clawed at me. For years I had avoided being alone with him, but here we were, surrounded by laughter and music, and yet completely isolated. "I need to go," I said, my voice shaking as I tried to step away. But he tightened his grip on my shoulder, just enough to send a shiver down my spine. "What's the rush?" he asked, his tone playful but with an edge that made my skin crawl. It was in that moment that I realized something. He wasn't just going to let me walk away from this. I don't know what came over me, but something inside me snapped. I spun around, my voice louder than I intended. "Don't touch me." The music stopped. Heads turned. For a moment, it felt like the entire world had gone silent. My abuser's face twisted into a mask of feigned confusion. "What's wrong with you?" he asked, his voice dripping with innocence. And that's when I said it. The words I had been holding in for years spilled out, raw and unfiltered. "You know exactly what's wrong. You've been hurting me since I was 11. Gasps rippled through the crowd. My parents rushed over, their faces a mixture of shock and devastation. My abuser stammered, trying to deny it, but the damage was done. For the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of relief. The secret was out. The aftermath of my outburst at the wedding was chaos. For what felt like an eternity, everyone just stared. Then the whispers started. Aunts and uncles exchanged wide-eyed glances. My cousins froze mid-step on the dance floor, their smiles replaced with confusion. My abuser recovered quickly. He played the role of the victim, his voice trembling with feigned indignation. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said, shaking their head in disbelief. "How could you say something like that about me?" I wanted to scream. How could he lie so effortlessly? How could he stand there, surrounded by people who adored him, and pretend he was innocent? But I didn't need to say anything. My parents stepped in. "We know what you did," my dad said, his voice low but steady, the kind of voice he used when he was angrier than words could express. My mom stood beside him, her arms crossed over her chest, Her lips pressed into a thin line, but her eyes betrayed the storm raging inside her. "You don't get to gaslight her," she said. "Not anymore." The whispers grew louder. A few people tried to interject, asking what was going on, but my mom silenced them with a single raised hand. "Not now," she said, her tone firm. "This is family business." I could see the cracks starting to form in my abuser's carefully constructed facade. His face flushed and he started to stammer out excuses. "This is ridiculous. She's making it up. Why would I ever?" "Enough," my dad cut them off. "You know what you did, and you know the damage you've caused." It didn't take long for the rest of the family to react. Some stood by me immediately. My grandmother pulled me into a tight hug, whispering through tears, "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I had no idea." But others weren't so quick to believe. My uncle, the abuser's sibling, was furious. "This is a serious accusation," he said, glaring at me. "Do you have any proof?" My hands shook as I tried to respond, but my mom spoke for me. "She doesn't need proof," she said firmly. "We believe her. That's enough." The room erupted into a storm of arguments. Some family members sided with me, expressing their shock and support. Others rushed to defend my abuser, claiming I was mistaken or exaggerating. The divide was immediate and painful. The wedding was ruined, of course. My cousin, whose big day it was, looked devastated. She didn't say anything to me as she walked out of the hall, but the look in her eyes said enough. She blamed me. For weeks after, the fallout consumed our family. Some relatives stopped speaking to us altogether. Others called constantly, either to offer support or to demand that I recant my accusation. My parents shielded me from the worst of it, but the guilt still weighed heavily on me. Had I done the right thing? Therapy became a lifeline for me during that time. My therapist helped me unpack years of buried emotions, shame, anger, fear, and gave me the tools to start healing. "It's not your fault," she told me again and again. "What happened to you was wrong, and you were brave to speak up." But bravery didn't always feel good. There were days when I wished I'd stayed silent, days when the weight of the fallout felt too heavy to bear. I avoided family gatherings for months, unable to face the people who doubted me or the awkward silences that had replaced our usual laughter. Eventually, my parents convinced me to report the abuse to the authorities. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Sitting in that sterile police station, recounting every painful detail to a stranger, felt like reliving the trauma all over again. The investigation was long and grueling. My abuser denied everything, of course, but there were other victims, others who had been too scared to come forward until now. Hearing their stories broke my heart, but it also gave me strength. I wasn't alone. I wasn't crazy. The day the charges were filed against my abuser was both a victory and a bittersweet moment. Justice didn't erase the pain, but it gave me a sense of closure I hadn't thought possible. Slowly, I began to rebuild my life. I reconnected with the family members who had supported me, and I let go of those who refused to believe the truth. Most importantly, I started to find peace within myself. Looking back now, I see the strength it took to speak up. I see the courage it took to face my abuser and demand justice. And while the scars of what happened will always be a part of me, they no longer define me. Family gatherings are still complicated. There are empty chairs where people I once loved used to sit. But the people who remain, the ones who believed me, who stood by me, make those empty chairs worth it. Because family isn't about blood, it's about trust, love, and safety. And now, for the first time in years, I feel like I found that again.